Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, you sound great.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah. Hi, Lynn. I'm Charlie.
Hey, Charlie.
Uh,
I'm Lynn.
yeah, well, pleasure to meet you. Just told Janan goodbye. She's going to catch a earlier flight.
No, not a problem. I'm happy to be here with you all.
Yeah, well, I mean, she's been pretty much here. The Eric and Ryan just
Yeah.
finished up, and she was just in the room, didn't even say anything. She just has been with us, and so we've got. It'll take the next 3 or 4 minutes, and then we're going to be down to about 40 or 45 people, looks like.
Great.
So, but anyway, we'll get started. You got any questions?
No, just will you introduce me?
I will introduce you. So I have your speaker bio in the program.
Oh, great.
And they've got that, so I'm not going to, I'm going to let that speak for itself.
Sure.
And I will do a recognition and introduce you, yes, and then you take off with it.
Fantastic, Charlie. Thank you. And you can see my screen as well, right?
I sure can. Yeah, we've got you up here on the big screen.
Wonderful.
And, I can see your screen, and so they should have a copy of your handouts.
Great.
They were sent out, and so we're.
So you'll introduce me, and then I know to start. So not a problem.
Okay, so about 2 minutes, I guess we'll get that going.
Sure.
I'm gonna have to do some rounding up.
Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Okay, well, let's get going. So this will be our presentation on IV billing, how to ensure a cash infusion. We have through our Zoom connection here, through Symmetry's Zoom connection here, we have Lynn Labarta, and she is a vice president with Symmetry. You've got her bio summary is in your program, the insert in your program. And so we will say hello, Lynn, greetings, welcome to our conference, and here you go.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Charlie. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on today's presentation. Like Charlie said, on IV billing, how to ensure a cash infusion. I'm really excited to be here, excited to talk about this topic because it's been a hot topic for the last year. And not only that, but it's been a bit of a confusing topic as well for the last year too. So I'm happy to be able to clear things up and answer as many questions as I can as well. So let's get right to it. Let's talk a little bit about our learning objectives for today's presentation. First, we're going to really summarize the home infusion benefit and talk a little bit about what exactly that is, because that in itself has been a bit confusing. What's covered, what's not. So we'll get into all those details. We're going to discuss as well the difference really between the home health benefit versus that home infusion benefit, because they are clearly different. They're separate. So we'll talk about that as well. We're going to discuss the billing requirements for the HIT services, so you'll understand how to bill the HIT services. And lastly, we'll discuss the common rejections or denials that we see for this particular benefit. All right, so let's get right into the home infusion therapy benefit and what exactly this is. All right, so what is home infusion benefit? And for short, they call it the HIT benefit. So you'll hear me throughout the presentation talk about HIT, and it's just an abbreviation for home infusion therapy. The home infusion therapy benefit, the HIT benefit, involves the intravenous or subcutaneous administration of drugs or biologicals to an individual at home. So this benefit is a benefit that is not provided in a setting like a hospital setting or a clinic setting. So it's really important to understand that this benefit is for a patient that is at home. So again, it's a benefit provided for a patient in the home setting. It's a separate Medicare Part B benefit that became effective January 1, 2021. So, essentially it's a separate payment for this specific benefit. The payment is limited to certain drugs. They're specific medications that are covered under the HHA benefit, or rather the HIT benefit. Sorry about that. It's the HIT benefit. And again, HHA benefit, HIT benefit, it gets very confusing. So know that this is about the HIT benefit. And there's specific drugs that are covered under that benefit. And we are going to get into exactly what drugs are covered under the HIT benefit. That'll be in the next coming slides. And this is a benefit that is a part of the Part B, the Medicare Part B benefit. So there may be co-payments that would apply, because when it comes to home health, we all know that we're billing Medicare Part A and we're getting paid 100%. But when it comes to the HIT benefit and HIT billing, we're actually billing Medicare Part B and we're being paid at 80%. So that 20% is going to be a remainder that is going to be either patient responsibility, or we're going to need to bill the insurance company if the patient has a secondary insurance in order to cover that, that 20% that Medicare doesn't cover. So that's the difference really when it comes to the payment. All right. So the new HIT benefit covers the services component. And that's important to understand this, that it's the services component, meaning the professional services, including nursing services, any kind of training that's being done, education, because all of that is not necessarily, it's not covered by the DME benefit. So that is the gap that the home infusion therapy benefit is filling. Also, if there's any monitoring being furnished by the HIT supplier, that also needs to be administered. And again, it is administered in the home. So nurses typically train the patients or caregivers to self-administer the drugs, educate on side effects and goals of therapy, and visit periodically to assess the infusion site and provide dressing changes. The home infusion process typically requires coordination among multiple entities, including, of course, you're going to coordinate with the patient, physician, the hospital discharge planners. You need to coordinate with the insurance company, possibly the home infusion pharmacy, and maybe even a home health agency if required. So essentially, nurses are the key role here. They play a very large part in the home infusion benefit. Education, training, and even remote monitoring, if necessary, must be provided for the home infusion therapy benefit. Now, note that the monitoring portion of it can be through the phone. So that qualifies for monitoring, a phone call. Also, if you want to use any of those remote monitoring systems, that would also qualify for the monitoring portion. And something I do want to mention, because this is a common question that we get, is you cannot bill separately for the monitoring that you're furnishing during the home infusion therapy benefit. So Medicare considers that service to be bundled into the payment for the infusion drug administration calendar day. So you're not going to be able to bill separately for the monitoring if you don't have to do any kind of monitoring if it's not necessary. But if you are, it'll be through the form of a phone call or through a monitoring system, and it would be just part of that bundled payment that you're going to receive for the home infusion therapy benefit. And we'll talk about payments in the upcoming slides. All right, so the home infusion therapy services are covered for the safe and effective administration of certain drugs. And, I underline certain drugs because I'm going to show you the list of the specific drugs that are covered under this benefit. And they're administered either intravenously or subcutaneously for a period of 15 minutes and at the home, of course. So I'll show you what those certain drugs are. And of course, they need to be covered. They need to be provided at the home. Administration of the drug must be through a pump and know that the pump is an item that's provided by the DME. And we will get into what the home infusion therapy provider has to provide rather than what the DME provider has to provide. But just know that the pump is not something that the home infusion therapy provider has to or supplier has to provide, but the drug does need to be infused through a pump to qualify. The infusion pump and the supplies, including the home infusion drugs, will be covered under the DME benefit. They've always been covered under the DME benefit, so that doesn't change. And we are going to talk about DME versus home infusion because that is also a bit confusing. So we'll get all of that cleared up during this slide presentation. The home infusion therapy service benefit provides a separate payment in addition to the existing payment made under the DME benefit, thus explicitly and separately paying for the infusion therapy services furnished in the patient's home by a qualified home infusion therapy supplier. So I think what the most questions that we get and what seems to be the most confusing part of this HIT benefit is what exactly is the home infusion therapy provider responsible for? So essentially, what is or is not covered or has to be supplied by the home infusion therapy supplier? That's really where we see the confusion and where we want to be able to clarify that. Since, and that confusion exists because the DME benefit is still in place. So the next slide, I think, here it is. It's actually a pretty good slide that shows you exactly what the home infusion therapy provider is responsible for. So, there's a few components used in providing home infusion. So this is really a fantastic slide that clarifies what is actually covered under the HIT benefit versus what's covered under the DME benefit. So if we look at this slide, everything that's in a solid blue line shows you what is covered under the DME benefit. So the infusion drug, as supplied for the effective use of the equipment, the durable medical equipment, that's a DME item, which is the external infusion pump, and any other supplies like the tubing and the catheters, anything like that, that is all a component of the DME benefit. And it still exists and it's still being paid under the DME benefit. Now, what you see in the dotted red line is the HIT professional services. And those professional services are your nursing services, the monitoring visits, and that is what is a separate payment. So the qualified home infusion therapy supplier is not required to furnish the infusion pump or the drugs or any of those other supplies, as you can see, by this slide. This is all covered by the DME benefit. So as you can see, the DME benefit is still involved. So you can see, that only the professional services portion of the home infusion is what is paid separately. So this new infusion benefit, really all it's doing is carving out the professional services. It's carving out the nursing services that are required and providing a separate payment just for that component. All right. So what provider types qualify to bill HIT? All right. So accreditation. Only a qualified home infusion therapy supplier can bill for services under the new home infusion therapy benefit. So a qualified home infusion supplier must be accredited by a Medicare approved accrediting organization and does have to apply for a Medicare Part B number. And we'll get into all those details. So you're going to need to be accredited by CHAP or ACHC or any one of these AOs. So note that this is a separate, specific HIT accreditation. So just because you are a home health agency that is accredited currently by ACHC or CHAP or Joint Commission, it does not mean that you are eligible automatically to provide HIT services. You have to actually get a separate accreditation through these organizations for the home infusion benefit. So that was also something that was a little bit confusing. Agencies were thinking, well, I'm already accredited by CHAP or ACHC, so then that means I can, I'm automatically a home infusion therapy supplier, and that's not the case. You have to have a special accreditation for that. In fact, it goes a little further where you also have to fill out an 855B application through CMS. So it's the CMS 855B application in order to get a Medicare Part B provider number, because again, this is all billed through Medicare Part B. So the Social Security Act defines a qualified home infusion therapy supplier as it could be a pharmacy, a physician, or another service provider in a state where they are authorized to provide services. Again, it could be physician, a pharmacy, or any other type of supplier that is authorized to provide services in that state. So, for example, a home infusion therapy supplier can be a DME. It can be a DME. It can be a home health agency. It can be a pharmacy. And in fact, a home infusion therapy supplier can also be even a private duty HHA. So even a private duty HHA can be a home infusion therapy supplier. Now, a home infusion therapy supplier is not required to also enroll in any kind of DME, services or be a supplier for DME. You do not have to do that. And that's where you have to clearly understand that these are separate services. DME still exists as it always has, and it covers the pump and the drugs and all of those other tubing, catheters, all those other service, products that are required. And the professional services are separate. All right, so let's talk about what types of patients qualify for HIT. All right, so to be eligible to receive home infusion therapy services under the home infusion therapy benefit, a beneficiary must have Medicare Part B and meet each of the following requirements. The beneficiary must be under the care of a provider or a physician assistant, a physician, a nurse practitioner, or a physician assistant. The beneficiary must be under a physician established plan of care as well. So, you know, be very careful when you are pulling the eligibilities for this service. You really want to be sure that that eligibility clearly states that the patient has Medicare Part B benefits. Otherwise, your claim is going to get rejected. So know that as a home health agency, you're billing Medicare Part A, so the patient can have Medicare Part A or B, and you can bill them and get paid. When it comes to HIT, the patient has to have Part B. So there's got to be an entitlement date for an enrollment date for Medicare Part B on the eligibility. So that's important because I've seen that to be also a confusing part of this when you're billing. All right. So a patient must be receiving parenteral drugs or biologicals that are administered intravenously or subcutaneously for an administration period of about 15 minutes or more. We'll talk about minutes also in the coming slides. Drugs must be furnished in the home setting. Yeah, I've said that a few times, but important to know. We get a lot of questions about, can we do it in a clinic setting or in a hospital setting and still get this extra payment? The answer is no. It needs to be through a pump. That is, of course, an item of DME. You don't need to supply this as a HIT benefit supplier. And it is, that portion of the pump is covered by the Medicare Part B DME benefit. So again, like we discussed before, it can't be provided in the hospital setting, and there are specific drugs that qualify for this payment. And that's a very important point. They're just very specific drugs that are qualified in order for you to get this extra payment. And we will discuss those in a second. Now, before we do that, we want to talk a little bit about the home infusion therapy benefit versus the home health benefits. And again, that was a confusing topic. That's why I wanted to make sure we had some slides discussing the differences. So, you know, a patient is not required to be homebound to be eligible for the home infusion therapy benefit. That is clearly something very different than HHAs. So again, as a home health provider, the patient does have to be homebound. But if you are going to take a patient for the HIT therapy supplier benefit, you do not have to be, the patient does not have to be homebound. So that's clearly different. A patient can be homebound though, and under a home health plan of care and require home infusion therapy services. So they can have both requirements. And in that case, the patient can receive both the HHA services as well as the HIT services. So you can be seeing the patient at home at the same time for both of these benefits. And in addition, the home health agency and the home infusion therapy supplier may be the same entity in the case where the HHA is approved for being a home infusion therapy supplier. So that means that they do need to be accredited, as we discussed before, by one of the accrediting organizations. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to provide the services. And I'll clarify that a bit in the coming slides. All right. So if a patient is receiving home infusion therapy, it needs to be on, and they're also actually under an HHA plan of care, and has received a visit that is unrelated to the home infusion therapy, then the payment would be covered by the home health benefit and billed under the HHA services and under the HHA claim. So I think the key word here is unrelated. If the visit is unrelated to the HIT benefit, then that's something that's covered by the home infusion or the home health benefit rather. If the HHA is a qualified home infusion therapy supplier and conducts a home visit solely for the services related to the administration of the infusion drug, the HHA would submit a home infusion therapy services claim under the home infusion therapy benefit. So again, any visits or services unrelated to the infusion is billed by the HHA as they normally do. And again, remember, we're talking about a separate benefit. So if you can think about it separately, it just makes it a little bit easier to understand. Now, anything that is related to the HIT benefit gets billed to Part B. So again, you have a patient, you're providing both HHA services and you're providing HIT services. So you're going to basically be billing to two different entities. You're going to be billing any services related to the home health visit to Medicare Part A, the same way you always do under home health agency, right? And anything related to the HIT, the HIT, you're going to be billing to Medicare Part B. Now, in addition, if you do have that combination of services, then keep in mind that, like we said before, you will be billing to both entities, and Medicare states that you need to have separate documentation for each of the services. So this is actually a conversation that I was having with some customers, I think about a week ago, and we were talking about, well, what exactly does this mean? And how are we going to separate these services? So Medicare doesn't clarify what exactly you need to do for separating these benefits, but of course, an option is having a separate, you have to have a separate plan of care, separate visit. What we concluded would be best practice is really to have a separate chart altogether, and that's up to you. You know, Medicare is not saying you have to have a separate chart. You could just have separate visits, but we just feel that it's best practice to have a separate chart for any services that are related to the HIT benefit and separate that from your home health chart. It's just going to make it a lot easier from a billing standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, from a charting standpoint. So I'm sure in your softwares, you'll be able to do, let's say, a readmission. If that patient's already with you on the home health side, you can do another admission and put some kind of special code or something in the software where you're identifying that this patient is receiving HIT benefits. So we just feel that that's a little bit of a best practice when it comes to separation of notes. But again, it's up to you. All right, so again, let's keep going on the differences. If a patient is receiving an infusion drug that is not identified as a home infusion drug, quote unquote, and we're going to go over what the acceptable home infusion drugs are, then the professional services for the administration of the drug would remain covered under the HHA benefits, and the patient is eligible, continues to be eligible for those services under home health. So, this has also been a common question that we've gotten, and understand that this is a separate payment and it only applies to specific drugs that are being infused. So in the next coming slides, I'm gonna show you exactly what are the drugs that qualify for this separate payment. So if an HHA does not intend to enroll as a qualified home infusion therapy supplier, they must notify the beneficiary that the home infusion therapy service is no longer covered under their home health benefit and offer the beneficiary the option to receive the necessary professional care from a qualified home infusion therapy supplier. And that's, of course, as of January 1, 2021. So obviously that date has passed. Any HHA is not allowed to provide a mix of covered and non-covered services to a Medicare beneficiary, especially when another provider, like a home infusion therapy provider, is available and able to provide those services under the new benefit. So essentially what this all means is, let's say that you have a patient that requires home infusion for a particular drug that is on the hit list, as we call it, the hit drug list. What this means is that if you are not a qualified therapy infusion supplier that is accredited, then you cannot provide those services. You can, of course, continue to provide the HHA services that you're doing, but you can't supply any kind of training, nursing professional services related to anything having to do with the HIT benefit for those particular drugs. So you'll have to bring in a qualified, accredited HIT supplier in order to provide that portion of the service. So I hope that's clear, because again, that's been a hot topic and a common question. If you are a home health agency that is qualified to provide HIT services, then you can do both. You're able to provide the home infusion therapy services, and you're able to provide the HHA benefit services as you always have. Again, if you are not, then only the portion of the HIT benefit for those particular drugs you can't provide. Now, with that said, if there is an infusion that the patient needs for a particular drug that is not on the HIT list, and I'm going to show you what that HIT list is soon, then you can provide that as a home health agency without any kind of accreditation, because it's just billed normally under your HHA benefit. Okay, so it's only these HIT drugs, they're very specific drugs that Medicare has carved out and is going to not only give a separate payment to, but also Medicare says that only HIT accredited providers can provide the home infusion for those drugs. All right. So let's get into what are the home infusion therapy plan requirements and what that looks like. So it's pretty straightforward when it comes to HIT. We've got a plan of care, and what is the contents of the plan of care? The plan of care must prescribe the type, the amount, the duration of the home infusion therapy services. If there's any kind of monitoring, that also has to be on the POC. The plan needs to include the specific medication, the prescribed dose, the frequency, and professional services to be utilized for treatment. The physician orders, again, must specify the frequency and discipline. The plan of care would specify the care and services necessary to meet the patient's specific needs. And again, this is to ensure that the most appropriate level of service is being furnished. The physician's signature, as in all plans of care, must be signed and dated by the ordering physician prior to submitting a claim for payment. So very similar to what we have now for the HHA benefit. The ordering physician must sign and date the plan of care upon any changes to that plan of care. The periodic review of a plan of care is also required. Same thing for HHA services. The plan of care for each patient must be periodically reviewed by the physician. So, you know, the expectation is that the physician is actively involved in the patient's care and can make appropriate decisions related to, you know, any changes in the patient's condition, and is involved in anything that's necessary in regards to progress and goals that, you know, that is all having to do with the infusion of the patient. So very straightforward, pretty much the same thing as HHA. But remember that you're going to have separate charts, hopefully separate charts as we recommend, or separate notes, whatever you want to do, but there will also be a separate plan of care. All right, so let's get into how are the home infusion therapy services reimbursed. And this has been quite tricky as well, because there's just been a lot of information put out there as far as the different codes that are being used. So agencies are a little bit confused as to how to build this. So again, I'm very excited to be able to clarify this on today's webinar. The home infusion is a separate payment for the professional services rendered. Payment is made for each infusion drug calendar day. And it's a bundled payment for home infusion therapy services. And it's only made when a skilled professional is in the home on the day the drug is being administered. So you're only paid for the days at home in which that drug is being infused. So that's an important point on this. And we'll talk more about it in the coming slides. And not only are you paid only for those specific days that the drug is being infused, but it's also based on 3 home infusion therapy categories. And those therapy categories are further classified into, they're basically linked with specific drugs that are covered under the home health or home infusion therapy benefit. And I will show you what those drugs are, but each category is linked to specific drugs. And those drugs usually have what's called J codes. So there's specific J codes that are associated to each category that we're able to bill. And I know it sounds a little confusing, but I'm going to show you some slides that are going to make it a lot more clear. And know that this benefit is covered through Medicare Part B, and it began January 1, 2021. So it's fairly recent. And when it comes to billing, you know, we're talking about all these different codes. We're going to get into a few other codes, which is why it was so confusing. But we're going to be billing G codes, specific G codes that were created for the HIT benefit. And I'm going to show you what those G codes are. And G codes probably sound a little familiar to home health agencies, because we are under Medicare, we are billing G codes now. So it's not very, very different from what we're doing. We're just billing it to Medicare Part B. All right. So let's get into the categories portion of it. There are 3 categories that are required to bill HIT. Category 1 has to do with your anti-infectives, your cardiovascular drugs, your pain management drugs, chelation, pulmonary hypertension drugs. So any drug that is related to any of these categories is basically set as category 1. Okay. Category 2 is specific drugs associated that are subcutaneously administered. Usually they're your immunotherapy drugs and other certain, you know, subcutaneous infusion drugs. And I'm going to show you a list of what those are. Category 3, which is your most complex infusion, is your chemotherapy and other high complex intravenous drugs. And category 3 is considered your highest paying group as well, because again, it's your most complex infusions. And Medicare has allowed us to, so for example, if you have a patient that has multiple infusions on a particular day, so users of multiple categories, multiple infusions are grouped within the higher category. So if you've got a patient that has multiple drugs on one particular day, Medicare has allowed us to bill for the category 3 drug, which is going to be your highest paying drug. So I'm going to show you an example of that as we move forward in the presentation. But just know that we do have the opportunity to get paid a little bit more when it's a bit of a more complex infusion. Okay, so these slides, the next, I think, well, actually, it's just this slide. This is showing, you know, from a billing perspective, the billing for HIT has been a bit confusing, and a lot of that has to do with all of the codes that Medicare has published, including these 9-6 codes. So, this slide is just to show you that the 3 payment categories are based from the physician fee schedule, okay? So the physician fee schedule includes these 9-6 codes, and they represent each category. So category 1 represents these 2 9-6 codes, and so on, category 2 and category 3. So from a billing standpoint, though, we are not going to be billing the 9-6 codes. We're going to be billing the G codes that were created specifically for the HIT benefit. But I did want to show you where your payment comes from. Your payment comes from the physician fee schedule, and it's specifically from these codes in the physician's fee schedule, but we're not going to be billing those codes under HIT. We're going to be billing G codes. So I'll show you what those G codes are next. So the 3 payment categories that we just talked about, right? Category 1, 2, and 3, they are further broken down into higher payments for initial visits and lower payments for subsequent visits. That makes sense. And there's specific G codes for each one. So you need to know, essentially, if you're doing a first visit or not, so you can associate the appropriate G code for it. So a patient visit to be considered new. So obviously, for a patient to be new, they either have never had home infusion before, or it could be considered new again if there's a gap of at least 60 days from the first home infusion therapy visit to the next. So the patient must have been discharged from a home infusion therapy provider for at least 60 days. If that's the case, then the patient is considered new again, and you're able to bill the higher, you'd be able to bill the initial visit because it's been 60 days or more since the last infusion the patient has had. Each category payment amount will be in accordance with the 6 CPT infusion codes described under the physician fee schedule and equal to a 5-hour visit of infusion. Now, I'm going to talk about what that means because that's also been a bit confusing. We just showed you the 6 CPT codes that come from the physician fee schedule, which is where your payment is derived from, but it's not necessarily what we're going to bill. We're going to bill the G codes, and know that the G codes are a bundled payment for a 5-hour block that is paid as the HIT benefit. And we're going to go over that specific detail. All right, let's get into the next slide. So, here is what our reimbursement will be for each visit. So this is a great slide. This is the national average payments, and these will vary depending on where you are in the country. These are the single bundled payments based on the drug type that we discussed, and they're paid up to a 5-hour visit. Now, the first drug category, as you can see in the slide, is your, we talked about that first category, which is your pain, your cardio anti-infective drugs. The second category we talked about was your immunotherapy category. And then the third category is your chemo drugs. So as you can see, your payment all the way to the right, your payment is going to vary. It's going to be higher. The first category is going to be a little less, second, a little more. And the third, being your chemo, is going to be the most payment per visit. And again, it's because it goes by complexity. The least complex infusions are going to be paid a little more, a little less. And then as you go down the scale to category 3, you're paid more. Remember that you're only paid for the days at home and when the drug is being infused. Although we are paid for that 5-hour block that we were talking about, it doesn't necessarily mean that you need to spend 5 hours at the home. Okay. This 5-hour block is paid to include any kind of care coordination between the HIT provider and let's say the physician or any kind of other entity that might be furnishing the drug, like the DME, you know, or maybe even the fact that you might need to go visit the patient again at the home on another day that the drug is not being infused. So if you visit the patient on a day that the drug is not being infused, you're not going to be able to bill for that day. Because again, remember, we can only bill for the days that the drug is being infused, and we're only going to be paid these amounts for the day that the drug is being infused. But that's why Medicare made a calculation of this 5-hour block payment in order to include all that care coordination and any kind of additional visits that you might need to make to the patient's home. Okay, so again, the point is you could spend 3 hours at the patient's home. You're still going to bill that 5-hour block and you're going to get paid that visit rate. You could spend 8 hours in the patient's home or go multiple times on days that the drug is not being infused and make many phone calls to the DME or the physician, and you're still going to get paid the same rate. All right. So let's talk about the drugs. The next 3 slides, or 2 slides rather, are the list of specific drugs in each of the categories that are covered under the HIT benefit. So remember we talked about before, here's category 1. The next slide is category 2 and category 3. So these are the specific drugs that are covered under the HIT benefit, which mean that they qualify for an additional payment, which means not only an additional payment, it means that you must be a HIT accredited supplier in order to infuse these drugs. So if you get a patient that needs these drugs from these 2 slides to be infused and you are not a HIT accredited provider, you cannot provide the infusion. Okay, so that's the most important point. If you get an infusion for a drug that is not on this list, it's not on category 1, 2, or 3, then you can. So that's been the most confusing part. So I found this slide to be quite interesting. It's just a little bit of information for you all. It's the utilization of HIT services based by visit, not only by visit, but by the drug category and the drug that's being infused. And this data was taken in the last year, really. It ended on 3/31/2021. And it basically gives you some data so you can understand what are the most popular drugs in each category that are being infused and what percentage does that make up of the HIT benefit. Okay, so this is just a nice slide for understanding what that data looks like. And I think what I did in the next slide, I was able to put in some key takeaways. So you can understand what are the most popular drugs, and you have to excuse me because I'm not going to get the pronunciation of these drugs correctly. I'm terrible with it. But the fluorosil, I apologize. I get tongue-tied when it comes to these drugs. But fluorosil, that drug from the category 3 happens to be the most common. That is the most common drug that's being infused under category 3. Milrinonin. So again, I don't do a great job of this, but that would be the second most popular drug that's being infused, and it's under category 1. And then the Hizentra and Hyquiva are going to be the 3rd most common drugs, and they're from the category 2 drug list. So the interesting thing that I found is that all 4 of these drugs, so for any clinicians that are out there, I'm sure these drugs are going to be, very recognizable to you all. These 4 drugs represent 70% of all of the HIT services out there. So I thought that that was, a very interesting point. And then of course, there's some other data about the different, what those specific drugs percentages are in the share of drug categories as well. But very, very interesting slide. It goes to show you that your chemo drugs are really what is infused most at the home, followed by your category 1, which are your cardios, anti-infectives, and then lastly, your category 2, which are your immunotherapy drugs. So very interesting data to understand. Now, the fluorouracil has to do with treatment of skin cancers. Usually, that's what that drug is related to. The milrinone has to do with blood pressures. Again, we talked about the fact that that's an anti-infective, pain, pulmonary hypertension category 1 drug. And then lastly, your Hizatrua, and the other drug has to do with your immunoglobulin drugs mostly. So again, I apologize for the pronunciation on those. I always do a terrible job of that. The single payment is limited so that it cannot reflect more than 5 hours of infusion for a particular therapy calendar day. So again, the patient and the drug that's being infused to the patient, the payment that you're going to receive includes any nursing services, training, education, monitoring services if required, and the payment is made per day of the drug administration day and includes any services the patient may need on any day that the drug is not being administered. That is why Medicare is paying us that 5-hour bulk payment that we discussed before. Now, in the case that there are 2 or more home infusion drugs or biologicals being infused concurrently on that single infusion drug administration calendar day, 1 payment is made for the highest payment category. So we talked about the fact that if there's multiple drugs being infused on one particular day, Medicare is going to automatically allow us to bill for category 3, which is your highest paying visit payment. In the event that multiple visits occur on the same date of service, suppliers must only bill for 1 visit and should report the highest paying visit with the applicable drug on those claims. Now, claims reporting multiple visits on the same line item date of service will be returned as unprocessed or basically rejected. So I want to, I'm going to showcase some common denials and rejections towards the end of the presentation. And that is one of the most common denials has to do with agencies, billing multiple G codes for multiple infusions on one particular day. So that's going to create a rejection. So know that just automatically you're going to bill the highest category, category 3. So obviously that's something that your billers need to know. So your billers have to understand what the regulations are for the billing in order for us to be able to bill appropriately and get paid. This is a common mistake that we see. All right. So let's get into how we're going to bill these claims. It's actually not as complicated as people think. It's pretty straightforward. But again, there was a lot of information published out there that did make it confusing. Providers will submit a single G code associated with the payment category for the professional services furnished in the patient's home on an infusion drug calendar day. The CPT codes that we just described in the previous table are what determine our payment, and they come from the physician fee schedule. But again, that is not what we're going to bill. We're going to be billing the G code. So as we mentioned before, those 96 codes are just to showcase and show you what our payments, where our payments come from, what drives our payments, but it's not what we're going to bill. We're going to be billing the G codes. The claim will include specific G codes in line item detail for each infusion drug calendar day. And the claim should include the length of time in 15-minute increments for which the professional services were furnished. So I'm going to give you an example, and I'm going to, you know, everyone here is probably very familiar with the 15-minute increment because it's what we're doing when it comes to billing on the home health side. So I'm going to give you some examples and even show you a claim form to make it very simple. All right, so the visit length is calculated in 15-minute increments. So your software is already set, hopefully, for any Medicare types of claims to be calculated in 15-minute increments when you enter times on your schedule, on your software calendar. So 15 minutes is going to equal 1 unit. And when you're billing HIT services in particular, it's regardless of the actual visit length. Remember, we talked about the fact that you're getting a single payment that equals 5 hours of infusion therapy services per day of the drug infusion calendar day. So it's a single bundled payment. Doesn't matter if you're there 8 hours or you're there 2 hours, you're still going to get paid that 5-hour bulk payment. The payment is a fixed per day payment, regardless of the line units and regardless of the units that you put in. Medicare doesn't want you to overstate your units. They don't want you to do that because they're not going to multiply any kind of units and pay you more or less. So basically what Medicare wants to know is if you're in the home for 2 hours, you're going to bill the actual units that you were in the home for, but no, you are getting paid that 5-hour block. Do not increase billing by line units or expect any kind of increased allowable. So if you take the visit line item detail and you multiply, and let's say you put in 10 or 15, whatever units, because it's the times actually spent at the home, you do that, but they just want you to know that you're not going to be paid anything more. Okay. So this slide is simply to show you what your time increments are and what 1 unit equals in the eyes of Medicare. We're not going to get too detailed into this because your softwares are typically preset with this information. So when you're going into your software calendar and you're entering your time in and your time out, your software should automatically calculate all of this for you when you set it to a Medicare payer, when you want to be paid by 15-minute increments. So I wouldn't spend too much time on this, but at least you have an idea what Medicare considers time increments. All right. So home infusion therapy services payment is contingent upon a home infusion drug J category being billed by the DME. Suppliers must ensure, so this is HIT suppliers that must ensure the appropriate drug associated with the visit was billed with the visit no more than 30 days prior to the visit. And the HIT providers or the HIT suppliers bill Medicare Part B with their associated G codes. So, this is very tricky because, and very interesting that Medicare has put this into a requirement, because what CMS is basically saying is that it wants the HIT providers to ensure that the DME supplier bills the appropriate drugs within a certain time frame. So our payment essentially is contingent upon what the DME does with their billing. So, as you can see, this is, this can be a little bit problematic because we're going to need to make sure we have very good communication with the DME in order to ensure that they bill timely. You're obviously hoping that they bill timely and according to their guidelines in order for you to be able to bill their, your claim. But this requirement seems to be put on the home infusion therapy supplier. So, you're gonna definitely need to be on top of this and have that communication with the DME. This reminds me a little bit of the hospice billing. So if anyone here at the association has a hospice agency, this reminds me a little bit of that billing where your billing is contingent upon what the other hospice does when it's like a transfer, a patient that's a transfer from one hospice to another. And that is very tricky because you have to be calling the other hospice and ensuring that they're billing so you can turn around and bill your claim. So this is a bit similar. You need to kind of have that good communication with the DME to ensure that they bill their claims appropriately and on time so you can get paid on yours. So it's just about having good communication with the DME supplier. There's really not much else you can do when it comes to ensuring that this requirement is being met. Okay, so let's talk about those G codes, what they are. So this slide is really about showing you what the G codes are that we're going to be billing that are associated with each category. We're going to need to get a little bit more specific information on, is it initial visit or subsequent visit, which we'll get into. But as you can see, the G0068 code, that is billed for professional services administered at the home. And it's really for your anti-infectives, chelation. This is your category 1 drugs. Okay, your category 2 drugs which have to do with your subcutaneous immunotherapies, that is your G0069 code. Your G0070 code, billed in 15-minute increments, has to do with your chemo drugs. And that is your, of course, most complex drug category. So I'm going to show you a better slide now. This is a great slide. This is a very important slide that you can cut and paste, keep it on your computer if you're going to be doing HIT billing services, because it's just one slide that shows you the initial visit, the subsequent visit. It shows you the category 1, 2, 3, what type of drug, what the G code is, and what the payment is. So this is, I love this slide. It is all encompassing. What's the G code for initial visit and what's the payment for category 1? What's the subsequent? So it's your category 1, what's the subsequent visit code and what is the payment? You move on, the same thing for category 2, and it shows you, what your category 2 G code is for an initial visit, the G0089, what your payment is, what is the subsequent visit code for category 2, which is your G0069, and what the payment is. And then the same thing with category 3. So it breaks down what each G code is that you're going to be billing for each category and which is the initial visit and the subsequent visit and the payment. So, I mean, if there's any takeaway from this presentation, it's going to be this slide. All right. This is also a great slide that shows you your 2022 HIT payment by G code, by category. So if you look all the way to the right, the last column tells you your final 2022 HIT payment amount. Remember, we talked about the fact that it's paid in that 5-hour bulk payment. So essentially, you'll be paid these payments to the right, depending on what category and whether it's an initial or subsequent visit. And it's only for the day that the drug is being infused. And it's being billed to Medicare Part B. So the next slide is going to be, it's really going to put everything together for you, because this is an example of what rates you would get paid for a patient with specific criteria. So the first thing we're going to ask ourselves in this example is this a new patient or a subsequent patient? It's the first thing. So remember, we talked about the fact that if a patient has had infusion before, but was discharged 60 days or more, then it's considered an initial visit again. Okay. So in this example, we are saying that this patient has had HIT services billed prior, or home infusion billed prior. It's been more than 60 days. So we're going to call this an initial visit. This particular patient has multiple drugs being infused on one day. So they're being infused a drug from category 1, which is a J0133 drug. And they're also being infused a chemo drug from category 3, J9000. So if there are multiple infusions on one day, what's the rule? The rule is that Medicare allows us to bill one G code, which is the highest paying G code, and it's the G0090. We're billing the G0090 code because it's an initial visit. Okay. If this was the same scenario, but it was a subsequent visit, then you'd be billing a different G code, the subsequent G code visit for the category 3 drugs. And you can just refer to the previous slide to see which G code that is. So the G0090 initial visit, you spent 104 minutes at the home. You're going to multiply that by 15-minute increments, or divide that by 15-minute increments and get your 7 units. And so you're going to be billing $331.75, which is that single payment reimbursement. So Medicare does want you to report, just to be clear, Medicare wants you to report the right amount of time that you spend at the home by the units, but it doesn't want you to multiply the rates by that. It just wants you to bill the exact payment allowable for that category and for that visit type. Okay. So to be clear, even if you spend less time or more time, they just want you to bill that single payment, but they do want you to report the time spent, and they do that because when they analyze, all of our data at Medicare, they want to know how much time agencies are spending and at a visit for an infusion. And that could constitute maybe a higher payment in the future because we're spending a lot of time, or even the opposite. If we're spending very little time at the homes, Medicare will have that data and they could even adjust our payments down. So you just know that you do have to report the appropriate time spent, but you're not going to multiply it by any kind of visit rate. You're going to just bill that single 5-hour bulk payment in that previous slide that we showed you. All right. So billing for qualified home infusion therapy suppliers, including home health agencies. So I think I'm emphasizing the including home health agencies here because early on, when this benefit was just being spoken about, there was a lot of information out there that said that home health agencies in particular didn't have to fill out an 855B and didn't have to bill separately. There was a lot of information out there in webinars throughout our industry stating that a home health agency, if they were a home infusion therapy supplier, an accredited home infusion therapy supplier, there was information out there that said that they can bill it through their home health agency. Well, that is not the case. It has been clarified since that a home health agency that is also qualified to be a HIT supplier, an accredited HIT supplier, does have to fill out an 855B, does have to get a Medicare Part B number, and does have to bill Medicare Part B separately. So I want to make sure we clarify that. HIT claims are submitted on an 837P, which is a professional claim if you're billing electronically. Otherwise, if you're billing on paper, which probably no one really does here, but it would be the CMS 1500 claim form, and it's billed to your Part B provider. DME suppliers also enrolled as a qualified HIT supplier would need to submit one claim for the DME supplies and the drugs as they normally do, and a separate claim to Medicare Part B just for the home infusion therapy professional services. So even if you are a DME or you're a home health or you're a pharmacy, whatever you are, doesn't matter. If you are an accredited HIT supplier, you are providing professional services for home infusion, you're billing it separately. You're billing it to Medicare Part B in a HIC 1500 claim form or a professional electronic claim form. With all of that said, I think this is also a very good slide. It's a snapshot of what your HIC 1500 claim looks like. This is, of course, everyone that's involved in billing knows this form. This is a great example. This is your HIT 1500. This, of course, can be, this is entered in your software. This is generated electronically, but this information that's on this claim form has to do with the example that we discussed earlier. So you're gonna, in that example that we talked about earlier, where you had multiple infusions and it was an initial visit, here is the G code that we're gonna be billing, G0090. It goes on that one line item, and it marks the dollar amounts from that previous slide. And you're just going to put the supplier signature, patient information, and the HIT supplier info. So it's really straightforward to bill on a HIT 1500 claim. So, you know, one of the last pieces of this is also a very common question we get, which is how to enroll to be able to bill home infusion therapy through Medicare Part B. And this is a pretty simple process. Excuse me. So in order to enroll, and we get a lot of questions on this, you know, regarding how exactly to be able to bill, you're going to, as a HIT provider, you must enroll with Medicare Part B as a contractor. And you can do that a couple of ways. Really, you can do it from, you know, through the online PICOS system, or you can do it on an 855B application. CMS states that, that they're considering creating a home infusion therapy supplier type on that 855 form or on the PICOS electronic enrollment form. For now, they don't have it. I haven't seen it, not even lately. So on the 855B enrollment form, in the meantime, providers can enroll using the other option on the 855 form, and you're going to add under other that you are a home infusion therapy supplier. Now, remember, we said you can do this electronically or on paper, whatever option. This next slide shows you what I'm talking about. This is the 855B form. Again, you can also do this electronically. As a home infusion provider, please make sure to check mark the other option that's circled on this form, and you're going to type in that you are applying as a home infusion therapy supplier. This is very important. If that part is not done and you select a different option or you leave it blank or whatever, don't assume that you're enrolled, because if you end up billing claims and this is not properly done, the claims are going to get rejected. This is also a very common rejection. So know that you have to have a Medicare Part B number, and Medicare can issue you a Medicare Part B number for the wrong supplier type. So that's why I say be very careful, make sure you're marking other and specify that you're a home infusion therapy supplier, because that is going to be required for billing. So before you bill, you've got to enroll. All right. So lastly, we're going to talk about some common rejections. There's really just a few very typical ones that we see out there. Let's talk about the first one. A qualified home infusion therapy supplier must have a specialty code of D6, effective for claim line items from January 1 to January 1, 2021. Otherwise, the claims are going to be rejected. And if they are rejected, you're going to get any one of these rejection codes that you see on your screen. Now, the D6 is exactly what we just talked about. It's that previous slide that we just showed you on the 855 enrollment. If you make a mistake on that 855 enrollment and you don't mark that other and that you're a home infusion therapy supplier, then you're not categorized as a D6 specialty. If you are not categorized in the Medicare system as a D6, then when you bill, you're going to get a rejection code with any one of these reasons. So if you ever bill a HIT therapy service and you end up getting a rejection like this, then typically the problem has to do with an enrollment issue at the 855 level. Okay, so the best thing is to contact CMS enrollment department in your region, and you're gonna, of course, call the Medicare Part B enrollment, and you're gonna try to talk to the enrollment department and figure out what's wrong with your enrollment application, because that is why you're getting this type of rejection. All right. Another common rejection that we see is that having to do with multiple infusions or codes being billed on the same day. So Medicare will only pay, we already talked about this, pay for one of the G codes listed per line item date of service. So if more than one G code line item is billed for the same dates, then you're going to get a rejection. And here are the codes on the screen that show you this type of rejection. So whenever you get this rejection, know it's because there were multiple infusions on a particular day and you billed multiple G codes. And we already talked about the fact that if there are multiple infusions on one day, you're just billing that category 3 code. Okay. So just know that any one of these rejection types have to do with multiple codes being billed, which is not allowed. And then I think this is the last, one of the last slides. Lastly, if a G code, if G codes are billed for dates of service on or after January 1, 2021, and there's not a timely billed DME claim with one of the allowable drug J codes as noted before, then that will also be a rejection. So what Medicare does is after you bill your G code, after you bill your claim as a HIT supplier, they are going to check the Medicare system up to 3 times to find the appropriate J code being billed by the DME. If they do not find the J code being billed by the DME, then you're going to end up getting a rejection like one of these listed here. So, as we talked about before, your payment is contingent upon a home infusion drug J category drug being billed by the DME. So you've got to have good coordination with the DME to ensure that they bill. So if anything happens like this, you're going to, contact the DME supplier and speak to them, see what's going on, in order to make sure that you get paid. So suppliers must ensure the appropriate drug associated with that visit was billed with the visit no more than 30 days prior to the visit. And again, this is something the DME does. It's a little bit confusing because there's just not much control we have as a HIT supplier with whatever the DME does, but good communication, I think, really solves for this. And we're hoping that the majority, 90% or more of the DMEs are not making this mistake, because then they're not getting paid. They obviously have billing problems if that's the case. All right, so I think this is actually the last denial or common denial that we see. If more than one claim, a line is billed with one of the G codes within a 60-day period, subsequent lines will be denied with the following message. So what this means, so essentially this has to do with rejections, with incorrectly categorizing an initial visit versus a subsequent visit. If that's the case, then you're going to end up getting this rejection on, any of these rejection codes on your remittance advices. So, we learned earlier that a new G code is used to differentiate between a first visit or a subsequent visit. So HIT providers are only able to bill a new G code to, really to initiate an initial visit for either a new patient or a patient who previously had their last home infusion drug visit 60 days or more prior to your current visit. So, it's very important that you're sure you understand what the timing is and you're billing the appropriate G code, whether it's an initial or a subsequent. If you make a mistake and you accidentally bill an initial G code and the patient has had home infusion less than 60 days, the CMS system is going to know, and they're automatically going to reject the claim because it's not an initial visit. They'll be checking that. So if you do get any one of these rejection codes, know it's because of that, and you're just simply going to have to change the G code to a subsequent visit and rebill it. Okay, and it's a possibility that you do make this mistake. We see this this is a common mistake we see, and it's really because the agencies maybe didn't know that the patient had home infusion prior, or maybe they weren't very clear on exactly whether it passed 60 days or not. And if that's the case, we do see this rejection, and it's just a matter, it's a simple fix. It's just a matter of changing the code. All right, so this is the last slide. Does anyone have any questions for me? I know this was a lot of information. So, you know,
Go ahead.
yeah, okay, so,
Totally.
you know, so a question that we get is, you know, a lot of agencies ask us, well, should we be a home infusion therapy provider? Do you see the value in it? Do you feel that it's worth it? So what we say to that is it's really the decision of the individual agency. It is something that needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. We like the idea of diversification. We like the idea of having multiple revenue streams. We like that. But at the same time, you need to analyze and look at that. Look at the list of J codes in the categories, category 1, 2, and 3. Look at the type of codes those are, the chemos, anti-infectives, immunotherapy drugs, and ask yourself as an agency whether you have referral sources, right? Or you can make connections with referral sources that can refer you these type of patients for infusion. If the answer is yes, that you do have these connections currently or can make them, then yes, the answer is it would be worth it for you to become an accredited supplier for home infusion and get that additional payment. If you don't have any connections in this world of infusion for those particular drugs, and you don't have the time, the bandwidth in order to establish this new line of business, then maybe it's not worth it, because you do have to pay a hefty amount of money for accreditation. And you do have to pay, you know, make sure you have a billing staff that understands how to bill this. So maybe the answer, if the answer is no for that agency, then maybe it's not worth it. So keep that in mind, and just remember that if the drug is not on the list, you can still bill it as an HHA. If the drug is on the list, though, you can't bill it. You're not going to be able to provide services for that patient. So again, you may be missing out on billing or on admitting those patients if you see that you are getting a lot of referrals for infusion of those particular drugs. So I think that's, you know, the last very important point that I wanted to make, because it is a very common question that we get.
Okay, are there any questions? Lynn, I want to thank you for your presentation and your time this morning. So much.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And again, if I know that everyone's on the spot now, but you know, if you do have any questions that come up, my email, my information is on the last slide. Please feel free to email me at any time. I'd be more than happy to answer any of your questions regarding the HIT benefit, or even anything related to home health or hospice. That's our expertise. So any questions that you have, anything related to billing the home health benefit, the hospice benefit, or the HIT benefit, please shoot me an email. Thank you so much. Thank you, Charlie, for having me, and have a great rest of your conference.
Our pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Have a good day.
You too.
Oh.